Hezekiah's reign saw a lot of major events, including the fall of the northern kingdom. Hezekiah witnessed that. I'm not sure, as I say that, if that was while he was reigning or if it was a bit before, but he was alive and he witnessed that. That would have an impact on you. If you see a kingdom like yours in many ways, with a history, the same history as yours, from where you came from, fall to the hands of enemies, you would be more inclined to take seriously the words of the spiritual leaders who talk about those things. And when you look back in hindsight and see that there were prophecies that said in the northern kingdom that it will fall because of their sin, and then you saw it fall, you would take those words seriously, wouldn't you? And so then when you have prophets in your own company who are saying similar things, what would you think about that? Oh, we need to listen to this. And this is kind of the environment that Hezekiah came up in. And his environment was not a good one, though. Who knows who his father was? We'll look at that in a moment. Who knows who in his father was? In some ways, you could say he did have Darth Vader for a father, Elijah, in some ways. Yeah. What's that?
Ahaz.
Yeah, Ahaz. One of the most wicked kings of the Israelites was Hezekiah's dad. And Hezekiah was one of the few who broke from the pattern of his father. And really, that's a sociological thing. Children being like their parents and fathers being like their sons in many regards. And Hezekiah, in almost every way, broke from the pattern of his father. And that was very good for the people, because little did Hezekiah know that his reign, for all the years that he was reigning, and the good things that he did that we're going to look at in a few minutes, before the invasion of Sennacherib took place, little did he know that he was preparing his own life and his people in Judah for what was about to happen when Sennacherib came against them, which was what we were just reading there. So Hezekiah's reign and his ministry alongside of Isaiah really was used by the Lord powerfully to prepare them to stand up to Sennacherib and be able to stay in a place where they're not totally destroyed and all of them wiped out, and God's promises to carry on his seed, the Messianic seed, endangered in that way, which it certainly became endangered a number of times. So he was a king who prepared God's people, but he didn't know that. He didn't know that he was preparing God's people for something so intimidating like this. And I thought, when I was looking at this morning, I thought of a time in my own family when my dad, who had gone through some years of backsliding, and you could call it that, and his faith had become, I don't want to say lukewarm, but he had become very discouraged and kind of given up on some of his dreams that he had with the Lord. And he was very frustrated with his work. He was working. He had gained some pretty high positions in the big construction corporations that he worked for, different ones. And my dad started to suffer from what has been called destination sickness. Does anybody know what destination sickness is? Destination illness. Where you're always living for the next thing. You reach a goal and you reach something that you were aiming for, and you get what you were after, and you realize it didn't have what your heart really desires, and you end up then striving for the next thing. You're always living. And I remember I would notice it as a kid whenever we would go for walks or we would go do something together. He was always in a hurry, and always, even in the little things in life. There was a period in his life where he was pretty discouraged. And he didn't give up on God, but he kind of gave up on some of his dreams in the Lord. And he had some periods there of backsliding. And our family was one that I was raised to love nature. Who else was raised to love nature? Yeah. We hiked and we fished and we camped when I was a kid. We'd go camping. And we were people who loved to go hiking. And when I was gone, had moved away and married, my dad would go on hikes for himself, by himself, south of here in the hills, the Bristol Hills and the Finger Lakes and the hills. Beautiful Letchworth down there, beautiful trails. And he would make a regular habit to go on hikes by himself. and he had a really fancy walking stick that he had sanded and polished and did all these things with, even in the winter. And he told me the story. One day, he was walking and he was praying. He was just somewhere in the woods by himself. And all of a sudden, God's presence came upon him so powerfully that he was overwhelmed just suddenly by God's presence. Scared, charged, scared, overwhelmed, and confused because of the power of the Spirit that just suddenly invaded him somewhere in the woods of the southern Finger Lakes. And he got down on his knees with his walking stick. And he said his heart was so overcome before God, he totally rededicated his life to the Lord there at that moment in the woods. That's a neat story about the backslider situation and about the mercy and grace of God and how he draws people. It was God's touch on him that pulled him back. He totally rededicated his life to the Lord. He immediately, his heart was warmed and his spirit was revived in the Lord, and he immediately started making decisions in his life and set his life in direction with the Lord and the things that he believed God had wanted him to do for years. For years, stuff that he had stayed away from. He immediately put himself in a position to do those things. And 2 months later, he was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma. Does anybody know what melanoma is? Skin cancer. It's one of the great white sharks of cancer. It's very aggressive. And by the time he went, at the time, he had terminal melanoma when the Lord touched him in the woods. But his upbringing, if you know our family story, the way my grandparents were, you don't go see the doctor until you're writhing on the floor in agony and, confusion. And I saw those kinds of things displayed in my family and my grandparents, how they would resist medicine. And so my dad, being like that, he didn't get it checked out until he was really aware that something was really bad with this spot that he had on his side. And there's a whole story about that, how that happened. So by the time he got it checked out, it had already spread to his lymph nodes. And once cancer goes to your lymph nodes, it's really bad news. And what we saw when I look back now is that that last year and a half of my dad's life really began, and it's just amazing to me that even his suffering and his cancer and all the fear and all the anxiety that came with that in his life was preceded by a revival in the Holy Spirit, and the mercy and the grace and the power of God. So thankfully, when God touches us, it's not always because he's getting us ready for devastation. It's not the only reason the Lord touches our lives. But I saw in my father the power of the Lord come upon him. He set his life in line with what he believed God wanted, his whole heart. And he was more excited when he had terminal cancer. He was more excited about the Lord in the last year and a half of his life when he was going downhill, and it became very, very fast downhill in the last months. It was awful. He was more excited about God and thankful for God and for his family than all of the years when he was relatively healthy and successful, high-paying positions in big construction corporations and all of those things. He wasn't happy when he had all of those things. And so I thank God for that. That's important for me in my grieving process, he died in 2005, so I don't have some of the things in my heart of grief that I did in some of those first 5-6 years. When I go to his grave, a couple miles from here, where there are many other Elim people buried, I stand there and I thank God for his grace in touching my dad's life and preparing him for a lot of suffering, a lot of struggle. How many people go through terminal cancer full of joy and excitement in the Lord? Yeah. Well, I saw God's touch. And so we see sometimes that the Lord does bring tremendous power and a resurgence in his people to prepare them for difficulty. Would you say that Israel and Judah had some backsliding? Oh, boy. That's the total understatement. Abandon the Lord. And God brings Hezekiah along to change the situation. And this is one of the brightest points in the history of God's people here while were still a nation. Hezekiah. 2 Chronicles 29. After the death of wicked King Ahaz, his son Hezekiah succeeded him, and it says here in 29 verse 2, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. Tradition has Hezekiah as a cousin and a possible son-in-law to Isaiah the prophet. And Isaiah, we do see that Isaiah had great influence in Hezekiah's life. He was a major source of spiritual leadership for King Hezekiah. The relationship of those two is very important in your understanding of the history of Israel and the history of God's people in the Old Testament. The way that God joined Hezekiah, young Hezekiah, with his mighty prophet, and the influence that Isaiah had on Hezekiah's life, and the way that God used Isaiah in Hezekiah's life, all is a part of God's plan to revive his people that cannot be overemphasized. It's important that you understand that relationship. Isaiah and Hezekiah. And his mother's name was Abijah, which means the Lord is my father. And this faith-filled mother, we also want to give credit to his mom. This faith-filled mother must have trained her son in the faith in spite of his wicked father Ahaz. So we look at Hezekiah's life and we see the way that he broke with so much wickedness in his father, who was one of the worst kings. And we ask, how did that happen? And we see the arrangements that God made, and he put a prophet in his life, he put in a spiritual leader who took concern over him in his life, and he gave him a great mom. Yeah. Some of us need to show more appreciation to our mothers for the faith that they instill in us. Come on now, is there anybody here you need to show more appreciation for your mom or your dad? Yeah, I just had my mom over for dinner last night. We had her over just to love on her and to tell her we love her and appreciate her. And so much of who I am as a person and the way that I walk with the Lord and the way that I think about people is because of my mother. And so we see a great mother here in Hezekiah's life. Appreciate your mother. Okay, that's just a little freebie there. 2 Kings 18, 9 through 12. During King Hezekiah's reign, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrians during the reign of Hoshea. King Hoshea was the last king of the northern kingdom, and he fell to the Assyrians. Hezekiah witnessed that, and would cause fear and trepidation in the hearts of everyone. The fall of northern Israel must have had a sobering effect on the young king, for he sets out in his reign to serve God with all of his heart. Isaiah 36 and 37 give us more about Hezekiah from Isaiah's perspective, instead of just from the chronicler's perspective that we have here in Chronicles and in Kings. 2 Kings 29, 1 through 11. The first thing King Hezekiah did in his reign, this is before Sennacherib comes from Babylon. First thing he does is to cleanse the temple of all the idols his father brought into the temple. Remember, his father went to the point where he removed the worship of the Lord and closed the temple. Yes?
So Hezekiah started doing things good and for the Lord when he saw the fall of the northern kingdom, or he was just from the beginning a good king?
What we get from, we don't get exactly when he started doing godly things compared to the fall. Although, if we look at all the dates, they would be pretty close together. It's more of something that I think it's safe to say that it had a major influence. Because people were, those were even parts of prophecies, that other nations will look at you and you will become a laughing stock, and other nations will be terrified because of the judgment that is going to come. So they were aware of what happened. And so it's more of something that's implied, that Hezekiah's having witnessed the fall of the northern kingdom. Yeah, but we don't, I wouldn't say that we can say for sure that that was like the launching point for him saying, oh my goodness, I need to walk with God. That was more having his mother in his life and his relationship with Isaiah that would have done that. Yep, good question. Good one. So what Hezekiah does is he steps into the position of what you could call, what has been called in modern leadership studies, it's been called sometimes a level 5 leader. Has anybody ever read about Tim Collins' work on, I think it's Tim Collins, Good to Great? Anybody ever read Good to Great? I think it's Tim Collins that talks about the different levels of leaders and how most leaders don't get to the place in their leadership of being a level 5 leader. A level 5 leader is a leader who is willing to fiercely enact change and make decisions, not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of the team, even when it's stepping on people's territories and crossing over into people's territorialism and things that they hold on to. And so Hezekiah goes in and he cleanses the temple and he cleanses the land of idols. Surely he was stepping on toes left and right. He was doing more than stepping on toes. He was fierce in that sense, not executing people or something like that, but he was fierce in his commitment to the Lord. Level 5 leader. He was bold and courageous, not for his own self, it wasn't this careerism thing where he's trying to gain for himself. He was doing this on behalf of the people and what he believed to be the best for the people that he was serving. So he was an outstanding leader. It's the first thing he did as king. A great and celebrative restoration of the worship and service of the temple was restored through Hezekiah's leadership. The atmosphere can be likened to a revival spirit in the church. How many of you have ever been a part of something that you could say was a revival time, whether it was called that? Sometimes traditionally we will call special seasons a revival. That's why I put that in quotes there. But revivals happen in the body of Christ even when no one calls it that and no one was planning that. Have you ever been a part that you recognize and you were aware that there was just an upsurge in people's faith, people's commitment to the Lord in your church that you come from? Anybody ever been a part of something like that? Where it just seemed like suddenly there was a charge in the air. People were coming back to the Lord, families being restored, people repenting and coming under the conviction of the Spirit and turning to Christ. This can be likened to that. What happened? Because of Hezekiah's leadership and God's faithfulness in his using Hezekiah in this way. 2 Chronicles 29:36. Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced, and this is what the quote here, rejoiced at what God had brought about for his people because it was done so quickly. Chapter 30:21. The Israelites who were present in Jerusalem celebrated the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days with great rejoicing, while the Levites and priests praised the Lord every day with resounding instruments dedicated to the Lord. So this was an awesome time of renewal and restoration for a people who had fallen so far away from God. And we see God using a leader to bring about his desires in this way for his people. And so we have some signs here of an Old Testament revival. This is a little brief study here that Professor Edwards gives to us in his book, and I thought this was such a great study. Signs of an Old Testament revival, like something you may have experienced. There was an Old Testament form of evangelism. This is amazing. People from the southern kingdom went to the northern kingdom to invite them to participate in the good things that were happening in the southern kingdom. That's almost shocking. Knowing that they would be rejected by most and mocked, they went to say, come and be a part of what God is doing. Wow. Something was happening in their hearts, wasn't it, for them to do that. People of the north. They were walking in the light. They were honest about their lack of purity or walking in transparency with each other. There was an acknowledgement of sin and their need for God's righteousness to be established in their lives. There was brokenness. There was a humbling of themselves and turning to the Lord before Yahweh. There was worship, joyful and celebrative worship, passion to spend time in Yahweh's presence. They extended the Passover to a 2-week celebration. They said, 1 week, we're done already? Let's go another one. Let's do it again. They were excited. There was a surge in the spiritual environment. There was joy. A tremendous joy fills their hearts as they celebrate the Passover and then as they go to their homes. It was happening in their corporate gatherings and in their homes. And there was true repentance, turning wholeheartedly to Yahweh and giving Him 100%. 2 Chronicles 31:1. The people spontaneously cleansed the land of idols. This was an awesome time for God's people. Have you ever needed a revival in your life? You ever slid, maybe quickly or slowly, away from a place of full devotion to the Lord? How many of you have ever been there and have ever been in that place would be able to say that it was because of the environment of other believers that I was around that my heart was warm and God drew me back to Himself because of what was happening in a group of other believers and other people, maybe a church or a conference or a ministry? How many of you would say that's the case? Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely the case for me. My dad's story of being revived in the woods alone is sort of like an idealistic story of something that is a problem in our society in the sense of individualism. If you were to say, well, I'm just going to live, just like your dad, I'm just going to live just me and Jesus. Most of the time it's not like that. And really, that moment right there was drawing upon his years and decades of being in the local church. And he was a part of a community, and he did have Christian friends. And so he was alone at that moment, but he wasn't alone as a believer. And so we see this swelling atmosphere of holiness and the moving of the Spirit in God's people. You stick yourself in the local church, you plant yourself there, and God will use those people to encourage you and to build you up and to help you walk in His anointing and to keep faithful to Him. You plant yourself in the local church. And we see God doing this in a tremendous way among His people. Okay, so and I could get into a whole thing about what does it mean to be planted. And there needs to be a main pot. You are a part of a generation that participates in something called multi-churching, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it could be that your parents said, we love our pastor and we're a part of this church, but the youth group over in this church has way more to offer, so we're going to take our family to worship here, but you're going to this youth group on such and such a night, usually Wednesday night, right? Or Sunday night. You're going there, and then your sister Susie is going over to this one on Tuesday because of the preteens discipleship group. How many of you have been a multi-churching person? Were you a multi-churcher? Okay, just a few. Anybody else that just doesn't like? I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. So, and it's just a normal thing nowadays. When I was pastoring, I had a hard time with that sometimes. Why can't our church be all things to all people? And it's just not possible in our Western society where people are so aware of, that's a whole other discussion. So, but I had to learn to release people and just see God in that and see them meeting their needs. But the danger with that is that if it forms you to think that you don't have to be committed in a people, planted in a people. So how many of you keep plants over the winter? I have a little window garden. It's therapy for me when I look out the window and it's dark and dreary and snowy. I like snow, but I miss the garden, so I have a little window garden. Right? Who else keeps plants in the winter? For whatever reason, you enjoy that. Oh, it's just you and me?
I have giant sequoias growing in my kitchen.
You have what?
Giant sequoias.
Oh.
Sequoias?
Yeah.
Wow!
I have a
Fit your house.
Well, they're only that big.
Giant sequoias.
That's what they're called!
Your nature looks I saw another hand over here. This massive one. Who else? Raise raise their hand? Okay, a couple others. We're coming out of the woodwork here. Yeah, it's fun. I have plants that can't survive in the winter that I keep in the window.
Yeah, which one?
If my apartment gets sun, I'd have it in.
What's that?
Our apartment doesn't get any.
Oh, yeah, see, and I couldn't do that until we got the back apartment.
Yeah.
It gets sun. Yeah, so I have like a southern magnolia in a window that I got from a seedling that comes from my, okay, everybody, let's come back together here. And I have some, I just got curious one day and I was eating a clementine and I was like, oh, and stuck the seeds in the pot and out came like a couple months later these little clementine trees. So I have a little lemon tree and a grapefruit tree. And so, but when you look at a pot, the reason I'm telling you this is when you look at a pot, the roots go down and are nourished in a single main pot. A plant does not do well if it sends roots out all over the place and having them stretched across into other pots unless it has its main roots in one pot. Are you with me on that? Now there are some plants that can survive and then actually reproduce by doing this little boing, and they put a little spring out, right? Spider plants, and they put strawberries do that. They send out this other arm, and then it roots over here. And there's all kinds of analogies that I find in metaphors for spiritual things that come through the natural world. But unless there is a central main rooting that takes place, there's going to be trouble when difficult times come, and droughts. Yeah, Grace.
I can actually testify to that. My family, I don't know, probably most people in this room have guessed it. My family's conservative Mennonite.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the past 4 years, I've split my time between a conservative Mennonite church and charismatic church. And I cannot overemphasize how incredibly difficult that is, and it's not conducive to growth.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're so confused all the time, and you don't know who's right and who's wrong. It's pretty much, you get to a point where it's so difficult that you don't know what God is saying. And
You
you
can
can't
get
hear
sure.
God, and it comes between you and God because it's so confusing. You don't know what's right and what's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so there are risks to that. Some of the good is that you grow to appreciate God's presence in the midst of people of other traditions, and not just your own tradition. And you won't suffer from what I call aquarium syndrome, fish tank syndrome, where you only see the world from your fish tank, and you forget there's a whole ocean out there. You know, like the fish we have in my son's room. They don't know. They think the whole world is this big. They think the entire body of universal water is this big. Well, it's 55 now. So, Aaron.
How I always explained it when I was on the streets talking to that there's one body, like one church. I'd always just relate it to like the hibachi barbecues. You know, you get all the coals in there and you get them on fire, but you have to keep the coals nice and close. But if you take one out and you put it over on the other side of the barbecue, it turns white and cold.
Yeah.
And that's what believers do. We just keep each other hot and fiery and sharpen each other and stuff.
That's right. That's right. If you're off on your own, you cool down very quickly. And we need to thank you, Aaron. We need to be a part of a set of burning coals in the Lord. So I want to say again that there's value to cross-pollinating and being cross-pollinated by other pots and plants, and I'm speaking of communities of faith. But you need to put your roots down in a main pot. Commit yourself. Get to know people, get to be known, to where you cross the bridge of familiarity. What happens when you become really familiar with people and they become really familiar with you?
They start to open up to you. It starts to become like a meaningful relationship, something that you can draw on.
Yes. And Matthew, I'm so glad you said the positive part, because I was thinking about the negative part. I'm so glad you said that. Thank you for balancing me out here. You get close to people and you really start sharing in life together, and there becomes a connection there that is a source of life. But you also have to learn how to walk in grace, because you start to see their problems, and they start to see yours, and you get annoyed at wonderful people. And happens in community sometimes. It's true. And sometimes they don't want to see you on Sunday morning, but you need to be able to worship together, and maybe you do need to not talk together for a couple weeks or something to give each other some space. But you need to be together and learn how to walk together in grace. I'm preaching today. And so, a main faith community is so important. We send one of our children. We have a main church. We are on the launch team of Impact Church, the church plant in Victor, New York. Yeah, Shannon's there, and Aaron's there. Who else? Let's see. I think we have someone. Yep, Maria's there, and worship team. Jacob's there. He drives an hour once a month to be there. Yeah, and so. But we have found through our kids' relationships over the years with some other Christians, and it's also a far drive to do that again on Sunday night, to go out there. Because of our kids' relationships, one of our children goes to a youth group over in this church, a Baptist church, and they're wonderful people, and we know the leaders, and they're wonderful. And then another one of our children goes to a youth group over here in this charismatic church, but then our family goes and worships in Impact Church. And so we're doing that too. But we know our values say, get connected, get to be known, and sort. Okay, I think we're ready to move on, don't you? All right. But all of that is because when you're in need, you will have a source of life there. God will flow through the gifts and the hands and the words of other people to bless you. And you will be there connected, and you will be swept up. It's very likely when the Spirit of the Lord begins to flood His church. And you don't want to miss that. Okay. And so what we see is that this time of renewal, restoration, revival, whatever you want to call that, all of those words apply. God was preparing them for a tremendous threat that was about to come against them. 2 Chronicles 32 and 2 Kings 18 to 19 give us a lot of details. And we also have some in the book of Isaiah that give us insight into this. The revival had prepared the hearts of King Hezekiah and the people to walk in faith during an attack of their enemies. They were built up in the faith. God's presence was in their midst. They were full of the Spirit of the Lord, and they were more ready to face a huge threat. Assyria sends a huge army and surrounds the city of Jerusalem. Do you know that you can find pictures online that people have taken of the remains of siege works that were built against cities? Sometimes small cities and sometimes large cities. There are still mounds in the Middle East of some of these Assyrian and Babylonian siege works where the stones remain, and there's, over the years, the top layers have decayed and become soil, and it's been a lot of years, and they're grassed, or they have, just scraggly shrubs. But it's actually this odd-looking little slope because it was a battle siege ramp that they had built. I think that's pretty incredible.
That's really sweet.
I would like to go look at one of those someday. Yeah. And to think about this, it was these people, the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They did that. They made that. They sent a huge army, surround the city of Jerusalem. Hezekiah falls before the Lord in prayer. The scripture says in one of the accounts that he tore his clothes. So it wasn't that fullness of the Spirit and that faith and the confidence made him go, God's going to take care of it all. A threat like that, when you're really under the gun like that, which is, in our terms, which is what it was, it's normal to respond with fear and to feel intimidated. And we've talked about this before. We saw other godly kings who took that fear, they grabbed onto that, and instead of letting it simmer in their hearts and spread like a poison among the people, they directed their own heart, and they led their own thoughts. And sometimes we need to be leaders of our own thoughts, lead ourselves. And Hezekiah led the people to turn to the Lord in prayer. This is what he did. They called upon God. They took that fear there. 2 Kings 19, 32 to 37. God responds to their faith and miraculously destroys the 185,000 man army of the Syrians. What it could have been is it could have been some kind of plague that came upon them during the night. We don't, it could have been a plague or poison, something. And here's what's interesting, is that archaeologists have found prisms with a cuneiform text from Sennacherib, or one of his scribes. The way that they would record these victories and things, we have a picture of it here. This is a 6-sided clay prism found in Nineveh with the cuneiform text of King Sennacherib's early campaigns when he came in, and it includes when he came into the land of Judah. And what we know from history is that Sennacherib, his threat was not just a threat that they were wondering what would happen. It wasn't that Hezekiah was just saying, I wonder if he's really going to come in here and he's really going to, is he just bluffing? He came in force into the land of Judah and he was sacking villages and towns all over the place on his way to Jerusalem. He was winning everywhere he went, making his way to Jerusalem. And this is what Hezekiah was aware of. We're next. And the interesting thing is that on the prism, Sennacherib stops short of saying that he was able to take the city of Jerusalem. And so he stops short of saying that I defeated Jerusalem. But what he says is that and the words he uses, I caged Hezekiah in like a bird. That's what he says. And Sennacherib's version is that he intimidated Hezekiah to the point that he bought him off. And that the reason he didn't take Jerusalem was because Hezekiah was willing to give him of the treasure and then to pay tribute to Sennacherib. And so Sennacherib's account, what he said was, that was good enough for me, basically, I'll leave the city alone, they're going to give me tribute, and then he left. And it's not uncommon for the kings of Assyria and Babylon to skew things in the direction that would make them look like always the victor. There's nothing unusual about that. So we have the conflicting report of Sennacherib on his prisms that were discovered. And then we have the biblical accounts which say that God struck down 185,000 of the soldiers, and Sennacherib was so intimidated that he bolted. And that's why he didn't take the city. So we have the question, whose report are you going to believe? Whose will you believe? Yeah. But it's interesting to see, though, that even in Sennacherib's report, he doesn't go as far as saying, and I took the city, and I cut them into pieces, and lay their bodies out, and all the kinds of things that they say about the other cities. It's interesting that he wouldn't go, and it's probably because what I think is that if he had claimed and lied, people would know about it. Jerusalem was a great city, was a world-famous city. They would have known. And so we come to our familiar situation, and I'm calling it Hezekiah's slip, because he did not abandon the Lord. He did not turn his heart on God or become hardened to God. Aren't you thankful? But he made a serious slip. So I'm calling it that. 2 Chronicles 32, 2 Kings 20. Hezekiah became deathly ill, and he was told by Isaiah that the Lord said to Isaiah, and Isaiah reported this to Hezekiah, you need to put your affairs in order because you are about to die. That's, how'd you like to get that word from the Lord? From your good mentor and spiritual leader. And so Hezekiah entered into the familiar tradition of the Jews, and I left the word out here, of the prayer of lament. And it's something that is largely left out of popular Christianity, because it seems to be at odds with how we are supposed to walk with God, to cry out to Him and to complain, and to try to convince God otherwise. And you see, Hezekiah heard that the word of the Lord was that he was going to die. And he sought to convince God to act on his behalf by reminding God Not that God didn't know, but in one sense, in a gracious way, arguing with God, in the presence of God, saying, God, look at my track record. Look how I have lived for you. And what happened?
Extends his life 15 years, right?
That's right. As Isaiah was leaving, the Lord spoke to Isaiah and said, Isaiah is going to be healed. Hezekiah is going to be healed. And an interesting thing is that Isaiah then prepared a poultice, which was an ancient form of medicine that's still used sometimes, especially with horses. Poultice of figs, part of a medicinal practice there. And what we know is that Hezekiah had developed some kind of a deadly boil on his body that he was about to die from. And by the word of the Lord, and by the medicine that Isaiah applied to his body, that's very interesting. Hezekiah recovered, and he was given 15 years. Yes?
Wouldn't the crying out, like the prayer of lament, wouldn't that be like, I feel like that's more God's way, like, because he calls us to relate to him, to have a relationship with him, not just to like, be robots pretty much. So wouldn't that be part of him relating to us?
Absolutely.
When we go in, we're not like, when we go to a friend, we're not saying, oh, okay, I'm just going to do whatever you say. A lot of the time, like, we'll go to somebody and we'll be like, we relate to them, and we'll be appealing to them and, arguing with them, and that's part of relationships. So I don't know. That's something that I think that we've lost in modern Christianity a lot of the time.
Me too, Matthew. And we have a number of issues. We are a culture that is very consumed with self. And we have all of our followers on our social media, and we celebritize ourselves and all those kinds of things. And I'm not saying that you do that, but that's just in our culture. We're very self-consumed. We're very individualistic. So we're already prone to focusing on self so much. So then to enter into these prayers or even liturgy in the church, all of our churches have liturgy, even though we may not use that word. We have orders and practices and habits of worship, the way that we lead God's people. We have psalms that are prayers of lament, where they would stand up and they would speak forth prayers that we read and say, are you allowed to say that to God? And there are some issues there with vengeance and anger and hatred that are expressed. Some of them express hatred for their enemies. And that is not a license for us to hate our enemies, but it was an honest, raw acknowledgement in throwing it all on God and saying, God, do something on behalf of your people. And we have all kinds of issues that in New Testament that we would need to look at. But we see here another instance of the word of the Lord being spoken, and then God changes the direction of what he had said is going to happen. And so Hezekiah is healed. So I gave you something to think about there, didn't I? And we see it as the mercy of God here. And then we come to, now we haven't even gotten to Hezekiah's slip yet. God provides a miraculous sign involving a shadow cast by the sun. Hezekiah was like, I can't, how can I believe that this is going to happen? I'm suffering here and dying. And God gives a miraculous sign, prove that he would recover. And while he was in recovery, the Babylonian officials, including the king of Babylon, deceptively celebrated Hezekiah's recovery. They sent an envoy to look as though they were celebrating Hezekiah's recovery. Hezekiah foolishly allowed a Babylonian envoy to see what it says in 2 Kings 20:13. All that was in his storehouses. The envoy came in and they flattered Hezekiah. Oh, what a great king you are. You're recovering. Your God is for you. Your God has healed you. And whatever they may have said, they flattered him to the point that he was taken advantage of, and he opened up the storehouses and he said, look at all that I have attained. And when those Babylonians set their eyes on those treasures, it got written into their minds, and they reported it to the king. And one day, the Babylonians came back to take what they had seen. And when he did that, Isaiah received a word from the Lord that the Babylonians would eventually come and take all of it away, and would take some of Hezekiah's own sons and make them eunuchs in Babylon. You know what a eunuch is? What does that mean, to be made a eunuch? That's not something any father would want for their son. And this is the word of the Lord from Isaiah. Some of your own sons will be made eunuchs in the court of the king of Babylon. That's bad news. And so Hezekiah uttered a selfish response about the coming disaster, calling it, he even said, this is good. This word from the Lord is good. Really? Because he had the expectation that it would not be in his lifetime, but only in his son's lifetime. And so Hezekiah later died, apparently without any major troubles. We just know after that he died later on. He was given 15 years. So we have a question that some have posed. Wouldn't it have been better if God had not answered Hezekiah's prayer for healing and allowed him to die from his boil? Wouldn't it have gone better for all of the people if God would not have acted so graciously and mercifully to restore Hezekiah? And interesting question. Grace.
Wasn't judgment coming anyway?
And that's the other side of it, Grace. There was the history that God was remembering, and things were coming to their full account, or debt, not account, but debt with God. And that, I would say, is a part of that. So, yeah, great. Okay, so that's the end of Hezekiah's life, and it just introduces Isaiah, because he's a part of this story and situation, very important part, crucial to what happened here. He brought the word of the Lord. And I want to introduce you, before you go today, the major prophets. We're just going to look at them here, who they are. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. We're going to start with Isaiah. He's tied to where we're at with the kings. And this chart, you can look at this in the PowerPoint. We can't go over all of this. But traditionally, we have given them names based on the themes of their ministry. Like Isaiah, we call him the royal prophet, the evangelical prophet, the messianic prophet, and you'll see why. He was in Judea, in the land of Judea. Then we have Jeremiah, who was preaching and speaking the word of the Lord to both the people in Judea and then later to the people in captivity. And then we have Ezekiel, part of the Old Testament, was God's prophet to the people who were taken out of their homeland and were in a foreign country as exiles. Ezekiel was the word of the Lord to them there. That's where I'm at in my personal reading in Scripture, reading Ezekiel and thinking about all of these things. And then we have Daniel, who becomes a prophet of the Lord to the Gentile kings and to the captive Jews. So we've got a summary of what their main themes are. And then we also have on this chart, down here, I want to draw your attention to this, the kings that each of these prophets served under. Some of these, there's some scholarly questions, we don't know for sure, but some of them name these kings, and then we know that they served during those reigns. Okay, very quickly, the Hebrew words for a prophet. Nabi. It's the main word. It's used over 300 times in the Old Testament. It's the primary Old Testament word for a prophet. And it means to bubble up, to boil forth, to pour forth words like those who speak with fervor of mind, fervently speaking with passion and energy under divine inspiration, to prophet or prophesy, a prophet or to prophesy. And so you could summarize that to say the word Nabi means to be a mouthpiece of God, to be the mouthpiece of God on the earth. And it gives the sense of a fervent preacher speaking forth the word of the Lord with fervency. Roach, to see, to view, to see visions and dreams, or more often, a seer. When we see someone called, he was a seer, a roach. And then Jose, to see in a vision, to receive revelation through a vision. Okay, last one. In the New Testament, writers understood that the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy didn't usually have a single fulfillment. They took into account the law of multiple fulfillments or multiple applications, and we talked about that. Prophecy usually has multiple fulfillments. There is the historical or past fulfillments during the time of the prophecy. Then there is intermediate or present fulfillments during the time of Christ or throughout church history. We remember Joel and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit still being fulfilled. And then we have future or eschatological fulfillment in the new heavens and the new earth when we come to the end of all things. And we're done for today, so blessings upon you. Have a great day.